federal government is not ensuring that our food is healthy. The state government is not ensuring that our food is healthy. There is not an effective regulatory mechanism in place.
I believe myself to be a victim of genetic engineering.
The FDA does not require even to be notified by a biotech company if they're going to introduce a genetically modified crop.
We're up against the best funded propaganda machine in the history of the planet.
So the public here in the US are really participating in a giant experiment with their health and with their environment without their knowledge and without their consent.
But these are companies with decades and decades of well-documented lying to the American public. Why should we believe them this time when they tell us, don't worry, these products are so safe they don't even need to be tested?
Genetic engineering of food concerns me a lot in this country because I don't think most Americans are even aware of it.
And it's not labeled because people wouldn't make a profit off of it if it was. They would decide not to eat it.
And if you read the actual documents from the FDA scientists, they said there are outstanding questions about safety.
Every one of these foods is on the market illegally.
We're losing that diversity that we need, we really require for the future survival of the crop, and therefore the future survival of humanity. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that it's really world food sustainability that's at stake.
Well, the protests, I knew about them, yeah.
We're up against the best funded propaganda machine in the history of the planet. And just as in the Iraq War, where the New York Times was forced to admit that they published a series of lies about the reasons for going to war, similarly they've been publishing lies about biotechnology.
We have the strange situation where US food corporations are exporting GE-free food to Australia because people in Australia don't want to eat GE, and yet those same companies are providing GE food here in the US because you don't have any labelling laws in the US, so the public are really denied the right to know and are denied the right to say no to genetically engineered foods. So the public here in the US are really participating in a giant experiment with their health and with their environment without their knowledge and without their consent.
I'm here because I don't believe that life should be patented. I believe that what has come from nature, our DNA, genes of life, have a right to live and perpetuate by themselves and don't need to be messed with or altered in any kind of way, and especially don't need to be owned by corporations who are basically stealing the knowledge, indigenous knowledge of medicinal herbs and plants and patenting them and making a profit. And I don't agree with that. I think life is life and it doesn't belong to anybody.
Get off the barricade! Get off the barricade!
You don't need so many cops on one person, you know? You don't need so many people on one. You don't need so many cops on one person. You don't need so many people on one. anyone who says no to GM foods or tries to have a say in the debate around GM foods. The cops jumped on this young kid, 8 of them, denying people the right to be able to videotape what they were doing. Because while our newspapers are full of what happens in the prisons of Iraq, they do not want you to know what they do to resistance. Our resistance has been criminalized in the United States of America, beacon of democracy and human rights. So that's what we just saw happening a couple of minutes ago. Or if you look at third world countries who are saying no to genetically modified food aid, we see USAID become the cop of the world, which jumps on them, threatening to cut off food aid. Or you have Senator Frist, who will introduce bills banning AIDS medications to African countries who are saying no to GM food aid. So that is the symbol. What we just saw is a symbol of that oppression and a technology being shoved down the throats of people, especially when they don't want it, whether it's farmers or consumers or third world communities or communities right here in the United States of America.
At Monsanto, we know that the health of your family is important, which is why we have all of our products tested and get the US government to approve them.
A lot of the research that's used by the biotech industry for their claims for safety have been described by other scientists as rigged to avoid finding problems. They over-pasteurized milk 120 times longer than normal. They heated corn 4.5 times more than normal before searching for intact protein. They used mature animals instead of young ones in feeding trials. They diluted their soy 10-to-1 before feeding it to the animals. They omitted the most incriminating research about differences in nutrients between the genetically modified soy and the non-genetically modified soy.
The federal government is not ensuring that our food is healthy. The state government is not ensuring that our food is healthy. There is not an effective regulatory mechanism in place.
The FDA does not require even to be notified by a biotech company if they're going to introduce a genetically modified crop. Although most companies say that they participate in a voluntary consultation in which they meet with an FDA person to discuss safety. They can show the summary data, choose what data they want to show, and they receive a letter from the FDA saying that the biotech industry company believes its own foods are safe. One company was an exception, that's Calgene. Calgene created the Flavor Saver tomato, designed for longer shelf life, although it's off the shelf so it didn't work. And they introduced it as the first genetically modified crop. So they asked the FDA to actually look at the detailed studies of a feeding trial. They fed the tomato to some rats. Actually, they force-fed the tomato because the rats refused to eat it. Several developed stomach lesions. And if you read the actual documents from the FDA scientists, they said there are outstanding questions about safety related to these stomach lesions that have not been answered. And yet the FDA approved the Flavor Saver tomato. It also turns out that 7 out of 40 rats died within 2 weeks after eating the genetically modified tomato and were replaced in the study without explanation. Recently it was found that rats that were fed genetically modified soy had misshapen cells in their livers, and no research has been done to follow that up. In June of 2003, scientists reported that the gene sequence of the inserted genes into crops had actually changed their order. They had re-scrambled. So the genetic inserts are not stable. Another laboratory confirmed this and found that it had changed in the same varieties in different ways that they had tested. So not only is it unstable and changing, it's not even uniform in the way it's changing. This is incredibly dangerous. A genetically modified food supplement called L-tryptophan was responsible for the deaths of about 100 Americans and caused 5,000 to 10,000 people to fall sick in the 1980s. The biotech industry claimed that the Japanese company that was genetically engineering its bacteria to produce this food supplement more economically, that bacteria wasn't the problem, it was a change in the filter in early 1989. However, new information shows that hundreds of people got sick during the 4 years prior to the change in the filter. Now, what does this mean? It dismantles this alternative explanation and puts the blame squarely on genetic engineering. What's really a shame, however, is that the Food and Drug Administration of the United States knew this information and never went to the public with it.
In 1989, I took tryptophan for a 5-month period, and later came to find out that the tryptophan was essentially poison, and it was on the same level as a nerve gas poisoning or a pesticide poisoning. So there was a period of acute illness where a lot of people died instantly after they took the tryptophan. The people who didn't die usually got serious cases of and varying degrees of illness called EMS. The EMS works by causing a high eosinophilia rate, which is a type of white blood cell that responds to things that people are allergic to ordinarily. In this case, the poison was so toxic that people had astronomical levels of eosinophilia. And what that did was create these white blood cells which would attack the poison, and then the eosinophils would explode themselves and create more toxins, so you actually got a double dose of toxin. So when the investigation started, right in the very beginning, there was some evidence that came out at the time in documentation and other places that they had changed their manufacturing process. And they had done 2 things. The first thing was to genetically engineer the product, and the second thing was they changed their filtration process. And that was a cosmetic thing, where they wanted the tryptophan to look whiter or cosmetically more appealing. So the information came out initially, but then shortly thereafter, when they realized that they were in trouble and a lot of people in the United States were dying from it or getting seriously ill, the information disappeared, and it was believed at the time that it was burned in a fire, or that's what the story has always been.
When scientists insert a gene from one species into another species' DNA, they need to artificially turn on that inserted gene. They use a promoter, something that turns the gene on 24/7 around the clock in high volume. They assume that the promoter that was used in almost all genetically modified foods would only turn on the gene to which it was attached. However, research has shown that this promoter can turn on other genes at random and keep them on permanently 24/7 around the clock. Which means that these genes could be creating allergies or toxins or carcinogens or anti-nutrients or something good. We don't know. It was found that after a single transgenic meal, this promoter was found intact inside rat tissue 3 days later. So it had transferred from food to internal organs. If this happens inside of us, it's possible that this promoter could turn on genes at random in our own DNA and pump out allergens or toxins or carcinogens or anti-nutrients. It's also possible that it could promote excessive cell growth, which may lead to cancer. Another possibility is that this promoter can switch on dormant viruses which have been embedded in our DNA for thousands of years. It's also true that this promoter has a recombinant hotspot. It means that it could potentially create genetic instability and recombination. So if we eat genetically engineered foods, it's theoretically possible that the promoter transfers to our DNA and causes DNA mutation. And these are just some of the scores of potential problems that can occur from genetic modification. The most common result of genetic modification is surprise side effects. We don't fully understand the science, and we're acting as if we do.
The environmental consequences of contamination with transgenic DNA are many, and they're of different natures, you know. At the simplest level, you could say there are as many possible consequences as there are different transgenic manipulations. And because the number of transgenic manipulations is endless, you know, people are manipulating or trying to manipulate corn, for example, to produce pharmaceuticals, to produce plastics, to produce, there is this horrendous spermicidal corn, there is also to produce that insecticide, also to be resistant to herbicides and so on. So you just dream it. Somebody is trying to manipulate corn for that purpose. So each one of those products, or so-called products, each one of those manipulations will have different consequences. The Bt producing corn, for example, the corn producing a toxin that kills insects, has serious consequences because it's leaking that insecticide into the environment, for example, through the roots. We now know that a lot of that Bt toxin goes into the soil and alters the microbial and insect community in the soil. The herbicide expressing genes or plants also has consequences because it's going to alter the way the crop as well as its relatives will respond to the herbicide. You have the development of herbicide resistance. And just like that, you know, you start looking at each one of the different so-called products of genetic manipulation, and they have each one a different consequence. Now, you can spend your life chasing each one of these biotech companies and trying to find out what they're thinking, what they're doing, and responding to each one of their products as it comes out. There are other levels of analysis, however, where you don't need to worry about that, where I say, I don't care what you're proposing. There are very specific problems inherent in the manipulation that make me very worried. For starters, the transgenic manipulation requires a so-called vector, as well as other pieces of DNA that go together with the piece that you want to insert into these organisms. That makes all these other pieces of DNA make this DNA attached to it promiscuous. That means the DNA that you are manipulating is not just any piece of DNA. It's a piece of DNA that has the property of inserting itself in different places. Wherever it finds an organism, wherever it finds a genome, it will insert itself quite successfully. That's why we manipulated it that way. So having that type of DNA released in the environment that we know is promiscuous, that we know is going to move more than any normal piece of DNA, is problematic. You can think of it as though you are introducing viruses and bacteria into the environment that have new reshuffled properties and that are going to destabilize the biology of those crops as well as any other organism that they can find themselves in. The fact that they are promiscuous too makes them liable to move horizontally. That means, or so-called horizontal gene transfer, that means that they can move from the species where they were inserted through a virus, a bacterium, or sometimes directly into other organisms, insects, other microbes, other plants, and yes, even human beings, you know. Sooner or later we will start seeing that type of movement, horizontal gene transfer, and we have no idea about the consequences. We have been putting out hundreds of thousands of acres of these crops without really knowing what the consequences are, and just that lack of knowledge is problematic to me. One of the obvious consequences of that, especially because this promiscuity makes the pieces of DNA particularly fit, that means particularly successful at leaving progeny into the future. one of the consequences of that is that you will have a trend, a tendency towards homogenization of the crops where you introduce these things. That means if this DNA starts moving around like it does and getting itself inserted in places like Oaxaca, where the world hopes to have the repository of genetic diversity, and starts pushing that diversity out and making those fields more homogeneous, then we're losing that diversity that we need, we really require for the future survival of the crop, and therefore the future survival of humanity. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that it's really world food sustainability that's at stake.
Monsanto sets the standard for agriculture with technology that is changing the way farmers do business.
Farmers have bought into biotechnology, especially in the Midwest, especially where they farm on an industrial scale, because they've been indoctrinated by the industry and its ally, the land-grant college, the land-grant university, for about 5 or 6 decades. That industry, born after World War II, started a systematic indoctrination of farmers all over the country in the 1950s. It was one of the most successful cultural education programs in the history of this country. And it convinced farmers that the way to go is to apply pesticides, apply herbicides, farm with chemicals. Better farming through chemistry, if you will, was the message they were delivering. Farmers bought it. The environmental impact of genetically engineered crops is claimed by the industry to be beneficial. The fact is, however, that what biotechnology does in agriculture is reduce biodiversity, which is one of the key ingredients in a healthy ecosystem. And of course, a healthy agriculture depends on a healthy ecosystem. They're after a quick fix, they're after a single solution, they're after the fastest dollar they can make on finding these quick solutions. When you ask me about how I feel in light of the kind of glib promises made by the universities and by the industry, as contrasted with generations of experience by farmers who know the land and know the crops, I respond with a mix of great sadness and anger. The sadness comes because I know the consequence is the loss of the beauty and the complexity and the reliability of an agriculture that depends on the health of the farm, the health of the ecosystem that supports the farm, and the health of the economy that supports both. My anger is about the exploitation of farmers, about the taking advantage of farmers. Farmers where I grew up in Nebraska are still making about the same amount of money. They're still being paid about the same amount of money for a bushel of corn that they were 40 years ago. Treating farmers that way, treating farmers as a disposable resource where we can casually discount their importance in this culture, pisses me off. And the consequence of that is, in the long term, devastating for the land and for people.
have any scientific background. The only thing I know is what I've either done wrong or seen go wrong. I have a lot of hands-on experience. First of all, I don't buy the story that the genetically modified companies are putting out, that they're trying to do all these good things for us with genetic modifications. They tout how they're going to develop beta-carotene enhanced foods so that they solve blindness problems in third world countries. To me, that would be easier to nutritionally improve something than it would to make it tolerant to a poison like glyphosate that is designed to kill everything. I don't buy it for a second. I feel that it's all about control and money and power from their part. I don't know how many people realize it, but there's kind of a neat circle in the pharmaceutical and crop production chemical business. If you look and do a little homework, you'll find that pretty well all the companies that are in the pharmaceutical business, Bayer, Upjohn Pharmacy, BASF, all of them are also in the crop production business. And I certainly hope that they're not, this isn't a plan from a financial standpoint in any boardroom at any place in time, but it's more than a coincidence that, okay, if we put something on the crop that has an ill effect to the soil and to the crop, and it affects what we feed the livestock, and we ultimately feed the people, and the people get sick, and they go to the doctor, and then they need to go to the pharmacist and get a prescription. Kind of makes a complete circle for what's going on.
The biotech industry and the universities they support, the university researchers they support, make the claim that genetic engineering is merely an extension of the genetic manipulation that we've been doing for 10,000 years. They're very careful about choosing language that won't scare people, about choosing language that seems to emphasize the benefits rather than the risks of unleashing this biotechnology into the environment where it can't be recalled and where its effects are unknown. Language is very much a part of the deception. Because the way we name things affects how we perceive them and how we relate to them. So if you visit a typical website of the biotech industry, let's say the website for Crop Life America, you will see beautiful pictures of green environments with happy children, and you will see words like enhancing seeds or improving crops. The intention being to create the impression that there is only good in this unnatural manipulation of plant crops.
At Monsanto, we are at the front lines in the battle against hunger. We are making sure that even the most remote corner of the globe is using our patented crop system.
Well, there are several questions then in terms of, does genetic engineering offer us a way to address the hunger issue? So we can sort of take apart the industry argument and show why it doesn't make sense at any level. First, they say we need to produce more food. That's patently wrong. Right now we're producing too much food, driving food prices down, crop prices down, and farmers into poverty, generating poverty and hunger in rural areas throughout the world. In fact, what we need to do is control overproduction, especially in the United States and Europe, so that poor farmers around the world can get fair prices for what they produce. So the first part of their argument, we can debunk that. We don't need to produce more food now. Number two is, if we needed to produce more food now or in the future, would genetically engineering be a good way to do it? And in fact, genetic engineering fails on a whole number of grounds. First of all, the most commonly genetically engineered crops, the ones that are resistant to herbicide, actually produce less per acre or per hectare than non-genetically engineered crops. On the other hand, those that have their own pesticide in them, that's the second most common category of genetically engineered crops, produce a very slight advantage in productivity, but one which is lost after a few years as pests overcome the pesticide that's incorporated in the crop. So neither way, and certainly averaging it all out in the wash, is there any increased productivity to be expected from these crops. On the other hand, we have agroecological ways of which we can easily increase food production dramatically. We see that small farmers who combine several crops together in the same field, instead of the empty space between the rows and the typical industrial monoculture, produce much more total agricultural product per unit area than do monocultural farms. They may produce a lower yield of one of the component crops, but when you add together everything the small farmer produces, it's much more per acre or per hectare than large industrial farmers. And it's a way better way, should we need to produce more food in the future, to do it than through genetic engineering.
We stood up to Monsanto, and it went to trial. It ended up the Supreme Court of Canada, where everything they came after me, they lost. They lost the case, but the Supreme Court ruled that Monsanto's patent on a gene is valid. It doesn't matter how it ends up in any life form, they own and control it. And that was a startling decision, is that even if you have your crop, organic farmer or conventional farmer, and your crop is contaminated, the amount of contamination doesn't matter. They own your seeds and plants, and if you use them, you're liable to a lawsuit under patent law. So that's what the case is all about, and that shows how Monsanto can get control over the seed supply and food supply through cross-pollination, direct seed movement, blowing in the wind or whatever. It doesn't matter how it gets there, the court's ruled. You don't own your seeds or plants anymore. So it would give them, the corporations now, total control over the seed supply, ultimately the food supply.
Well, the main reason why biotechnology companies are so interested in promoting GMOs, first you have to understand that most of the biotech companies were the major investors in the chemical companies that promoted pesticides. And then they started buying the seed companies because they saw that the field of pesticide use was going to be highly regulated in the United States and Europe, and the markets were going to be actually affected heavily because of these regulations. So now they are now promoting the second revolution, which is the biotechnology revolution, based on the use of this genetic material, which they are starting to control increasingly, and increasingly controlling also the food system. And it's basically for profit motivations. There's no other reason why this technology should be promoted at the level it is. I mean, we don't need soybean that is resistant to herbicides, and we don't need to increase the production of soybean or maize. There is an overproduction actually in the United States of these products. And as a matter of fact, 70% of all the corn that is being produced is to feed cattle, not to feed people. So there's no need to promote this. The only need is the control of the food system, so that their products that they sell can be marketed by making farmers more dependent on agricultural inputs. So before, farmers were dependent on just chemicals. Now they are depending on a seed chemical package because it's engineered to make them dependent. The herbicide resistance is a specific case, and that's the dominant crop actually. So Monsanto is basically dominating increasingly the market, not only of the soybean but also of the herbicides.
when the U.S. began its occupation of Iraq back in 2003, one of the stated goals on the part of a lot of policy people behind the scenes was to turn Iraq into a model for the next generation of neoliberal economic policies, to impose a level of forced privatization and corporate dominance over every area of life that goes far beyond anything we've seen really anywhere in the world. There were 100 special orders that were imposed by Paul Bremer when he was the administrator of Iraq under the first stages of the occupation, that were established in a way that they could not be overturned by any future Iraqi constitution. Order 81 had to do with control over seeds, and it made it illegal for Iraqi farmers to plant seeds that are not certified by some international authority. Now, Iraq is where wheat cultivation was first developed. It's really the cradle of human civilization. It's where agriculture was first developed, where people learned to cultivate seeds and till the land and improve crop varieties over time. So there are probably thousands of traditional seed varieties, particularly wheat varieties, that are unique to that part of the world that are no longer legal for Iraqi farmers to grow.
We shouldn't unleash this massive experiment on huge numbers of farmers and consumers throughout the world in the absence of knowing what it's going to do. If it were a matter of life and death and survival, the risk might be worth it. But it's not a matter of life and death and survival. It may be a matter of life and death and survival for Monsanto and a few other chemical companies, but for most of us it isn't. We can eat perfectly good food without having it genetically modified. And these companies promise that in Africa and other parts of the third world, they'll be able to solve the problems of starvation and hunger by means of these crops. Well, if they could actually do that rather than claim that they might be able to do it in the future, there'd probably be less argument about it. But the fact is that at the moment this is simply a propaganda point that they make to try and justify the technology, claiming to be caring about poor people. Actually, they've put almost no effort into caring about poor people. Their whole effort has been put into getting richer themselves. So I see no reason why we should have an experiment inflicted upon us by companies whose only aim is profit on this massive scale. It's not worth taking any risks at all on a massive scale if there's no benefit associated with them. The calculus of risk and benefit in this case comes down in favor of avoiding the risks and sticking with what we know and trust, namely regular plants produced by regular plant breeding.
In May of 1998, my organization, the Alliance for Biointegrity, a nonprofit public interest group, organized a lawsuit against the United States Food and Drug Administration. And it was an unprecedented suit in that it combined as plaintiffs many eminent scientists along with eminent religious leaders, all of whom had objections to the FDA's policy on genetically engineered food. And these individuals challenged the FDA's claim that genetically engineered foods are recognized as safe by an overwhelming consensus within the scientific community. The FDA claimed that these genetically engineered foods are so similar to their conventionally produced counterparts that they can be presumed to be just as safe and require not one bit of testing at all. These scientists knew that from a scientific standpoint, that is a very unsound position, that genetic engineering is inherently hazardous and it entails the potential for creating many unexpected disruptions to the functioning of the food-yielding organism. During the course of the lawsuit, the FDA was required to give us copies of all of their internal documents relevant to the policy they had made on genetically engineered foods. That meant we got over 44,000 pages of documents. Going through those documents was quite a revelation. What we found when we looked at the FDA's documents is that their own experts, their own scientific experts, had written memo after memo in the months preceding the FDA's issuance of its policies in 1992, stating very, very clearly that as a matter of sound science, genetic engineering had to be viewed as inherently different than traditional breeding, and that it did have the potential to create many unintended, potentially harmful side effects. They said very clearly in their memos, because of the potential for unintended, harmful side effects of genetic engineering, that every genetically engineered food has to be subjected to long-term testing, and that the whole food should be employed. Now, I have mentioned that the FDA top bureaucrats clearly were keen and actually overly keen, bending over backwards to support the biotech industry. One indication of this, and the extent to which the FDA went to have the industry's agenda represented rather than their own scientific staff's wisdom and knowledge, happened in the summer of 1991. They took on board, the FDA created a new position, Deputy Commissioner for Policy. And the primary first job of that Deputy Commissioner for Policy was to oversee and finalize the policy on genetically engineered foods. Now, who was it that gets appointed to such a very powerful and sensitive position? Was it somebody with great scientific background? No. It was a Washington attorney who was a partner in a very high-powered law firm who was representing Monsanto and also the biotechnology industry. He knew what Monsanto wanted. He knew what the biotech industry wanted, and he was brought over to the FDA. And while deputy commissioner, I don't think it's an accident that the policy that came out covered up the FDA's scientific concerns and basically gave Monsanto and the industry everything they could have wanted, and probably even more so. No need to test the foods at all. The FDA claiming that they're safe, the FDA essentially promoting them for you. Now, after having basically performed so well for the biotech industry, giving them what they really wanted, this individual, whose name is Michael Taylor, and after having set the policy favorable to Monsanto at the FDA, got hired directly by Monsanto to be vice president for policy. Every genetically engineered food that has come to market in the United States has come to market against the clear mandates of federal food safety law. Every one of these foods is on the market illegally.
Arthur Anderson was the consultant for Monsanto and asked the leaders in Monsanto to describe their ideal future in 15 to 20 years. The Monsanto executives described a world in which 100% of all commercial seeds were genetically modified and patented, and Arthur Anderson worked backwards from that goal to create a strategy and tactics to achieve it.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that people who want to see a sustainable agricultural system, who want to see organic fields and genetically engineered free crops, might get branded as marginal, might get branded as liberal or progressive, or even potentially unpatriotic. I find a great irony in that, because in my mind, the people who care about the local food system and who care about the integrity of the land and who care about growing food that's truly whole food are the true conservatives. So if I were going to reclaim a word for the organic food movement, for a food system that's free of genetically modified organisms, I would reclaim the word conservative. I think we are conservatives in the best sense of that word, and I think there's nothing more patriotic, if we think about patriotic in terms of meaning that we care about our country, we care about the place where we live, then we're the true patriots as well.
Personally, I have a hard time trusting the 5 or 6 companies in the biotechnology industry which now control our seed supply. I have a hard time trusting them because they are essentially the same companies that brought us pesticides, that told us that pesticides were harmless, that pretended to show spokespeople eating them on television by the spoonful. Of course, it turned out later what they were eating was powdered milk because they weren't stupid enough to actually eat DDT. But these are companies with decades and decades of well-documented lying to the American public. Why should we believe them this time when they tell us, don't worry, these products are so safe, they don't even need to be tested? It just doesn't make sense.
Genetic engineering of food concerns me a lot in this country because I don't think most Americans are even aware of it, and even when they're made aware of it, they don't seem that bothered by it. You know, and again, it goes back to the old, you know, it can't happen to me, or so what, or, you know, it's already probably being genetically engineered and I'm not dead yet, so why care, or whatever. It's hard to get people here riled up about such things. My daughter went to school in England for a short while, and we visited there a number of times, and just as an example, people in England, I mean, there was an article in the newspaper almost daily while, you know, anytime we went there, no matter what year it was, on genetic engineering, and they're much more attuned to it and much more active about it. So, I mean, I really don't know what it would take. Even the accident with the tryptophan didn't really seem to affect anybody because it was such a small group of people, you know, proportionate to the United States population, that people don't see it as a threat. So I don't know what else you can do other than, you know, die right in front of them.
Good, I think people need to have a voice. People need to push their government to change things. So one person I've just talked to said that in the United States, genetically modified food still doesn't have to be labeled. I think it's important so the consumer has a choice.
Well, from the point of view of the American consumer, I think the first thing is we should be outraged that these potentially dangerous products have been slipped into our food supply without our knowledge or without our approval. And we should be asking everywhere that we buy food, either the supermarket manager or the companies that produce especially processed food if their products contain genetically engineered ingredients, if they can demonstrate to us that they're free of GMOs or not, and insist that we will only buy products from them that are demonstrably free of GMOs, or if they or ask them to produce results of safety testing, which of course they can't do. I mean, we need to stick up for our rights, for a right to know. That means there's got to be labeling. For our right for products to be adequately tested before they're in our food supply, and for the right for to have products that haven't been tested or that have been shown to be dangerous to be out of our food supply. Basically, as consumers, we need to stick up for our rights. We know that that works when European consumers 10 years ago, as soon as GMOs hit the market, said they wouldn't buy them. It only took 2 or 3 years for all the major supermarket chains in Europe, in order to fight for customers, to say, we guarantee all our products are GMO free, and then the supermarkets, in order to attract those customers, then had to go to their suppliers and say, we'll only buy it from you unless you can prove it's GMO free.
I think, so if you know that there's genetically modified products in something you buy in the supermarket, just don't buy it.
It's not responsible to feed the products of this infant science to millions of people or release them in the environment where they can never be recalled. When independent scientists look at the research data that supposedly presents an argument for food safety, they're appalled. They said these foods should never be approved. We need to get these foods off the market, and this will take a concerted effort. One thing that we have going for us is this. Studies show that the more people learn about genetically modified crops, the less they trust them, the less they're willing to experiment in their own bodies by eating them. So we need to get the information out to consumers about genetic modification. So even if the government won't budge, even if the government is in bed with the biotech industry, we can still topple this dangerous industry. And that is by rejecting eating genetically modified foods.